attorney. She is a partner at Killmer, Lane & Newman, LLP. She has dedicated her career to advocating on behalf of vulnerable people and underdogs. Mari has represented numerous LGBTQ clients in cases involving discrimination in employment and public accommodations, and was lead counsel in the case of Burns versus Hickenlooper, which helped establish marriage equality in Colorado. Mari's awards include the LGBT Bar Association Foundation's Attorney of the Year, the Colorado Legal Initiatives Project, I don't say that word very often, Barista of the Year, and a Harvey Milk Lifetime Achievement Award. We're very excited to have Mari here as well. And we also have Cathryn Oakley, who is the State Legislative Director and Senior Counsel at the Human Rights Campaign, where she is responsible for advising legislators and advocates working to enact laws to further LGBTQ equality. She focuses in particular on passing non-discrimination laws at the state and local levels and combating anti-LGBTQ legislation in state legislatures, including bills preventing municipalities from passing non-discrimination ordinances, bills that would give state agents the ability to deny services from LGBTQ people, and anti-transgender legislation that limits the ability of transgender people, including students, to access facilities in accordance with their gender identity. So we've got this powerhouse of a panel here today, and what the frame for today is looking at the challenges and opportunities at the state legislative level that we've currently presented ourselves with, and wanting to really kick us off with what a lot of folks probably are thinking about and wondering about on how the recent Supreme Court decision around employment law and LGBTQ rights might impact us at the state level. So whoever wants to start, kick us off on what your view is on how it might affect.
I'm happy to start. So I'll begin by saying that it was obviously a fantastic decision, and we're very pleased. The case law is very consistent with the case law that had been percolating through the courts, but I do think came as a surprise to many, just with the idea that we weren't sure the Supreme Court was going to continue to follow that precedent and confirm that legal reasoning. So it was wonderful. I have good news and bad news, I think, about the state legislatures. I think, the good news is obviously because this has been such an incredible development that folks now can be secure that they have these protections at the federal level and employment non-discrimination, and hopefully very soon education, healthcare, and then many other parts of federal law that include provisions related to prohibition of discrimination on the basis of sex. I do think it's really important, though, to emphasize two things. One, we have to continue working on non-discrimination in the states. We are not done doing that, and that includes in employment. And that's for a lot of reasons. State employment laws are generally more far-reaching than Title VII. They include more employers, including more small employers. A vast percentage of people are covered or are not covered by Title VII because they work for employers that do not employ 15 or more people. But most state laws do and do include smaller employers. So we have to continue to do that. We also often have better remedies at the state level. We also want to make sure that people have as many venues as possible to be able to be bringing their claim. It may be more accessible for them to do so in state court. So for a variety of reasons, it is really important that we continue to pursue employment non-discrimination in the states. And of course, that doesn't include housing and public accommodations, credit, jury service, all of the other things where states do prohibit discrimination. And we need to make sure that sexual orientation and gender identity are added into all of the remaining states that still need those laws. Then I will also say I'm very concerned about the backlash. We have seen over the course of the last 5 years in state legislatures just an incredible onslaught of anti-LGBTQ legislation. And that started in 2015 as the Obergefell decision was in front of the United States Supreme Court. We know the population was ready for marriage equality, state legislatures not so much, and we had a huge onslaught of anti-LGBTQ legislation. That year was the year of the Indiana RFRA, people may remember. The following year, the Obama administration put out incredible guidance making it clear that Title IX included transgender students and that transgender students had rights under Title IX. And then we saw HB2 in North Carolina. So, you know, I could go on, but suffice it to say that what's happening at the federal level really does play out in the states. And I'm very concerned that our opposition is going to look at the Bostic decision and be very concerned. And we'll try to take that fight to state legislatures next year. Particularly worried about religious refusal bills and increased anti-transgender legislation. This year, we actually saw the highest number of anti-trans bills filed ever, including in 2016. So I'm very concerned about that continuing.
Of course, I agree with that. I was going to pipe in and say, I agree with everything you've said, particularly the concerns. I want to start for a minute with the celebration because when we all agreed to do this panel, I think we all thought we were doing a very different panel than it turns out we're doing. And while it was a little scramble for us to figure out what we were going to say, it was different than expected. I'm sure happy about it. And I've never been so glad to be entirely wrong in my prediction of what a court was going to do. But I do think that there are some kind of amazing opportunities here, because the Gorsuch opinion is very straightforward in its description of the fact that the discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity is de facto sex discrimination. And it doesn't mince words with it. And so it's helpful in a variety of different contexts, I think, at the federal level, but it will also trickle down to the state level, because of course state statutes often rely upon the interpretation of federal statutes once they're addressed in court. So in Colorado, for example, our Colorado Anti-Discrimination Act is interpreted in much the same way as Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So to the extent that the Gorsuch opinion is so clear on the fact that discrimination on the basis of gender identity and sexual orientation is sex discrimination, that will be great, not just for employment in the employment context, but for the Fair Housing Act, for Title IX, which prohibits discrimination in schools, for the Affordable Care Act, which I think is particularly interesting given the Trump administration's recent rollback on healthcare for transgender people. So I think, and it's going to show up across federal and state and local laws in the very broad and clear interpretation of Title VII, and the fact that sex discrimination encompasses all other kinds of discrimination as well. There are a couple of little bonus nuggets, I think, too, which maybe are only interesting to geeky lawyers like me. But one of them is that the employers in the Bostic decision were advocating for a different legal standard to prove discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. And what they were advocating for was a standard that required a heightened level of proof, that it was that the sexual orientation or gender identity was the sole motivating reason for the employment discrimination, or at a minimum, the primary reason. And the opinion rejected that entirely and used instead the same but-for causation as used in all kinds of other different contexts. And I think that's a great thing, because it means that the Supreme Court has explicitly looked at the idea, the argument that there should be some higher standard of proof required for sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination, and rejected that. And I think the second little kernel, which I don't know if people have talked about much, is the fact that the opinion just accepts without any significant discussion the notion of gender transition and doesn't make a big deal about it, and just sort of talks about it in a very matter-of-fact way, is much more revolutionary, I think, than people sometimes realize, because the religious right has an entirely different viewpoint on that topic and acts like it's conceptually something that we that shouldn't be presumed. And the way the opinion talks about it is so straightforward that I think that helps in a variety of other contexts to be seen. Of course, we can talk about the challenges, and I'm sure we still will. But I wanted to celebrate the victories for a minute.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, whenever it comes to Supreme Court cases, we've seen a few of them here in Colorado that have actually gone favorably for us. And these kinds of decisions really, in my mind, I think should help states really form policy of their own to align with these decisions, and do it while they can now, to align with that federal policy, because we should make sure that we're protecting everyone at the state level in case there is a reversal or some other kind of challenge that could change things later on. These are things that we should be actively trying to stay ahead of as these decisions come out. We've seen a few things here in Colorado. The Masterpiece Cake Shop decision was one everybody was watching, and that one ended up coming out in our favor. But this one, for me in Colorado, we've had these protections here for quite a while in employment. And, you know, I was worried about my friends in other states who don't have these protections, and that it may end up working out badly for them. But I was very glad that this decision came through in a positive way, because this would be a really, really bad setback, and we would have just a few states protecting people moving forward. But I think that, you know, state legislatures should start looking at forming their own policies, I think, at this point, to work on aligning, and I think that will be the way to go forward, because we in Colorado have been pretty leaders, been leaders in a lot of different ways, and I think we're right up there with Nevada with the most LGBT friendly policies and laws here. So there's not a lot of things that we can still do, but we can always find some more things that we can, and we will. But every time you can do any little step forward, it is a step in the right direction.
So as the legislator from Vermont, I will also make the shout out for Vermont in that we have some of the best LGBTQ supportive laws as well. So it's nice to be in good company. And the three of you, in addition to talking about the Supreme Court decision and kind of what that might mean overall and the impact of that, also touched on these different challenges and different opportunities that you see moving forward. And so thinking of if we can separate those out a little bit so that we can have, because it's such a complex issue. So if we look at first challenges that you can see and try to, so we can get those as clear as we can.
Do we want to go in the same order, or shall I just jump
Mari,
in?
why don't you go? Why don't we shake it up a little bit?
All right. Well, I think the Bostick decision leaves open explicitly two very clear challenges, and the worst of the two challenges, I think, is the one that Cathryn has already identified, which is the intersection between all of our anti-discrimination rights, but as they are implicated by religious freedom rights. And religious freedom has historically been used as a justification for discrimination. And I think that is really going to be where these fights really take place. That's going to be the essence of the fights. And the opinion is very clear in leaving open the fact that none of these employers were making religious freedom kinds of arguments in their reason for discriminating against these employees. So it was a set of three very clean cases where the employers weren't saying there was a variety of different reasons why we fired these folks. They were being straightforward. Yes, we were just discriminating. That's the only reason we did it, which, you know, makes for a nice, clean legal decision, but it certainly leaves open the real problem, which is going to be the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and, of course, First Amendment religious freedom discussions. And, you know, the Hobby Lobby decision in particular, which addresses the ability even of private corporations, private commercial corporations, to discriminate on the basis of their articulated religious beliefs. That's going to be a really, really big problem. I think the second very clear opening that the Bostick decision leaves is the perpetual problem of bathrooms and locker rooms, which is always the red herring for discrimination, as if the bathroom is like the biggest deal in the universe. People just want to pee, but you know, it has always been the place where these cases have gotten the most complicated. And in fact, I argued a case in front of Gorsuch back when he was on the 10th Circuit, and the case immediately before me, he was questioning the person about the bathroom problem. And it was like, you know, it's just not that complicated, but it always is the thing that people use to make decisions more complicated than they ought to be. And the Bostic decision certainly invites that discussion, and I think almost encourages the next case to focus on the bathroom.
And I'll jump in. I think a lot of the challenges with a lot of states are, you know, they do have enough people to vote for Democrats in a lot of these areas, but because of the gerrymandering and voter suppression and so many other things that have prevented people from being able to vote for their leaders that they want to see, a lot of these legislators are not able to fill the seats and actually get majorities, which is the way we pass these laws in a lot of these states. So, you know, these are things that kind of start out on a different level, but have a big impact of how things are really forming legislation and laws down the line. And I agree with Mari completely. We've seen so many of those bills come through Colorado. You know, they don't even do stakeholder work for these bills. They're just messaging. They don't actually do anything. It's like they don't expect it to pass. They just do it to satisfy the base of people that are supporting these religious freedom things. And you know, we had our own slate of anti-trans bills in the guise of parental rights. You know, parents know best for their children, and you know, they want to prevent their kids from being mutilated. And I mean, it's like the way that they frame these laws that they're trying to push through are just offensive. And I fortunately didn't have to listen to any of those bills because I'm not on that committee, but I did have to stand up and talk about those at the press conference because people need to know that these are just blatant, offensive messaging things to try to rally up some support in an election year, especially this year. But we've seen, even I was going through some of the older laws that have been tried to put through. One of them was a classification of discrimination and a right to disagree, to say that, you know, well, we just don't agree on that, so this is my justification for not giving you what you want. And I think that one may have been about the Masterpiece Cake Shop in particular, because that's where they were trying to go with the angle that the cake shop owner had. But you know, discrimination is discrimination. It's pretty clear, and it's been said so many times that we don't need to restate what that really is in the law. But they will keep trying to do this because that's the only thing that they really have in the minority right now is to message and to do things like that. But when it comes to states that do have potential to flip those districts, elections are going to be hot.
So Representative, I'm going to pause you there so that Kate can talk about the challenges, and then we'll next go into the opportunities. It sounds like that's what you're about to talk about. So Kate, what would you like to add to the challenges that you see coming up?
I always like to hear about flipping districts. That's one of my favorite places to start. But yeah, no, I mean, I agree with everything that the others have said. And what I'll sum up very quickly by saying that I think I agree that there are really sort of two-pronged challenge that's in front of us. First is this idea of religious belief being used as a sword rather than as a shield, and that there's a way to say, I have a deeply held religious belief that you are not who you tell me you are. And I want to go back to something that Mari said that was exceptional. It shouldn't have been exceptional about the Bostic decision, but it was, which was this very matter-of-fact acceptance that trans people are trans. It used appropriate names. It used appropriate pronouns. It didn't go into this whole question of whether or not being trans is real. It just accepted the fact that it is. And that should not be exceptional. That should be baseline public decency. But I do think it's important to point out that our opponents who are litigating these cases in court refuse to use proper names, proper pronouns. They talk about things like biological sex, like that's a thing. And it's not just our opponents, it's also the administration, as they have filed statements of interest now in a couple of different cases that are percolating. They're also refusing to use correct names, correct pronouns. And so that shouldn't be exceptional. I hate even having to talk about it like it's anything, but I think it is something that particularly lawyers should take away with them, that if you see that someone is refusing to use proper names and pronouns, you should feel free to point out to them that the Supreme Court can figure it out. They can figure it out too. So that's an aside, but I do think, this idea that you could have a religious belief that someone who says they're trans isn't trans, that you shouldn't have to use their name, that you shouldn't have to use their correct pronoun, that you shouldn't have to acknowledge that their transition is an authentic expression of who they are, right? That's the first sort of bucket of these challenges, which is going to be those religious-based beliefs. The second bucket, I completely agree, is going to be around trans folks, I think particularly trans kids. And I think that it could manifest in continued discussion about bathrooms. I think in the popular world, the conversation about bathrooms has sort of been left behind. I don't know that everybody is necessarily like at peace in the general populace, but I also think that people get it, that it's not, even if they don't totally understand, they get it that it's not nice and that they can kind of move along. I think the places that we're really seeing this sort of rubber hit the road right now with our opposition and trans issues, they're really focused, and again, this goes back to this idea of just not believing that being trans is real, of saying that trans kids shouldn't have access to appropriate transition-related care. And when you're talking about young people, by the way, honestly, what that often is puberty blockers and counseling. And, again, to Representative Titone's point, like they're talking about, oh, well, they're going to be mutilated and they're going through all kinds of mutilating surgery. And, that's not consistent with the standards of care. It's very hurtful language. It's really meant, it's not even because these are things that are happening, right? It's not addressing an actual problem. It is totally about messaging. And it is totally about creating this idea of saying, trans kids aren't capable of telling you what you want, telling you what they want. And their parents are imposing this upon them as some, part of a progressive radical agenda. And we see this become, football and custody cases. And, one parent is affirming and the other parent isn't affirming. And well, okay, the affirming parent is apparently undergoing, child abuse, right? Like, so these are some of the horrible bills that we're seeing happen in state legislatures. And I think we should continue to see bills that are trying to send this message, right? They're not based on actual problems, just like the bathroom bills. They're not based on actual problems. They're not based on actual things that are happening. It is all about fear and messaging and creating for folks this idea that being trans isn't a real thing. And then that's then pouring over into the athletics arena, where we're seeing a lot of bills filed this year that are saying that trans athletes should not be allowed to participate in athletics consistent with their gender identity. And again, for the most part, most of these bills are talking about youth. Several of them would reach to college, but for the most part, we're talking about youth. I mean, we're talking about, let's say, an 11-year-old, right? And again, when you say to a state legislator, like, tell me about all of the troubles that you've been having in your state with this issue. Tell me about what's going on. Well, they're going to tell you about the case that's coming out of Connecticut, where there are 2 young women who are saying that it is unfair for them to have to compete against transgender girls because the transgender girls are essentially faking being trans in order to be able to play in sports teams consistent with their gender identity, win scholarships, and go on to, dominate in sports. It is about getting to this. It's about advancing rhetoric that being trans isn't a real thing. It's something that people put on for an advantage. And that is, unfortunately, as I say, something we're seeing in way too many places. And, I do work in lots of states, some of them liberal, some of them not so much. And I have to tell you, I've never heard legislators in Tennessee care so much about what's going on in Connecticut before. I mean, it is astonishing, right? But nobody has examples of this other than the one case that they're going to point to in Connecticut. And they're going to keep telling that story. So I also think it's worth noting for folks who maybe don't know that much about trans participation in athletics that one of the plaintiffs who brought this case forward and said it's unfair because she couldn't possibly compete with, as she characterizes, a boy and participating in girls sports. She actually beat the trans athlete that she has been suing. So I'll just leave it at that.
I think Kate brings up a really important point, which is that many of these statewide legislative efforts are not homegrown at all.
No.
And so we saw in Colorado in the last session a collection of really horrifying bills. And what was really interesting about them was I actually brought a trans mentee of mine who was 13 years old to come and testify on some of the bills, and because they were very, very interested from a very personal perspective on these bills. And what was very interesting was that even the legislators who were introducing them, who were sponsoring them, didn't actually entirely understand the issues. And in one of the bills, the one that related to kids' access to counseling and mental health services in their schools without having to get parental consent, was one that actually, I think, really changed the mind of the legislator who had introduced it, because after hearing the testimony of all of these kids saying, look, I come from this non-affirming household, I really just need to be, you know, when talking about the statistics of suicide and of mental health problems and all of the struggles that trans kids have, and needing to be able to access certain kinds of services without parental consent, I think it was a real eye-opener for somebody who thought, oh good, I've got a good red meat like Republican issue that I can bring forward in my state legislature. And
well,
no idea how much I was hurting people.
Yeah, and I very briefly, I completely agree, and I think it's worth underlining that these are not homegrown bills. There are organizations who are behind these that are pushing them, and that I would say the vast majority of the sponsors of these bills do not understand the issues or the harm that is caused by these bills, and it's a huge challenge.
I called them unoriginal bills because they can't come up with their own ideas. They have to take them to somewhere else.
Eyes on your own work.
Right.
And that's a great transition into thinking about the opportunities, because part of what I'm hearing from you all is thinking about educating legislators as one particular opportunity about what the actual experience and meaning in both their own states, but also the experience of being trans and what the law, the bills put forward might actually mean for the lived experience of particularly young people that you all were just talking about. And also just want to make a note that we're talking about different political parties, and Representative, you were talking about the different gerrymandering and things like that. So just want to have the clear expression in the C3 conversation that ACS is not endorsing any particular political party or candidate, but that you all are speaking from your own perspectives and are reflecting your own opinions and not necessarily ACS. So I wanted to just put that out there before we talk about opportunities. And Representative, you started talking about some of the opportunities around the upcoming election. So I don't know if you'd want to say more about that or something different. And so wanted to pass it to you about opportunities.
Sure. Well, you know, you bring up a good point. You know, equality isn't always partisan. We have several legislators who are on the Republican side that do vote with us on equality bills, and we're very grateful for those votes that we get. In fact, I was quite surprised that my gay and trans panic defense bill passed unanimously in the Senate and only got one no vote in the House. So it only had one no vote overall. It was quite astonishing that they all decided that this was a good idea. So I think that, you know, it's about being fair with elections. I think is really what it comes down to, is getting the voices of the people heard, and more people are starting to accept LGBT people, and more people are accepting trans people. You know, I've been elected for 2 years now, and I've been getting a very good reception, because it's not about me being trans, it's about me doing the work that the people need me to do. And they're like, oh, I guess trans people are wanting to help the community too. And, that's kind of, why I decided to run for office to begin with, is to make a statement about trans people being a valuable member of the community. And I think that goes a long way, except, I thought my presence in the legislature would prevent these bills from being introduced, but they still were. So there's some people's minds are never going to change, and they're trying to really, placate to certain voices in their community that they've always gotten support from. But I think that, the more we talk about it, the more we normalize the issues that we're having, and what discrimination really means, and how it hurts people, and how these bills that they're introducing are really just picking on vulnerable groups of people. People will understand that, and then they will vote for the people that are not picking on these groups of people. And it goes back to gerrymandering and making it fair to have an election, that a lot of those voices that want to be heard are not being heard, or are being grouped together with other people that are very similar to them. And I mean, my district is very 50-50. I have a lot of people on both sides of the aisle. And as a matter of fact, I have more Republicans in my district than Democrats in my district. But they still decided to elect me. And I think that's fair, because they're judging the person and not the party, and what way I can actually deliver to them. So I think that there's a lot of opportunities for working on getting voter suppression out, make sure everybody has a voice. Colorado, we just did automatic voter registration. I had 75% turnout in my 2018 election. And I would love to see a lot of other places in other states have the kinds of turnout that we have, and the participation that people have with mail-in ballots. I mean, imagine that.
Imagine that.
So it really works, and people actually participate because they don't have to worry about going on a certain day at a certain time, and worry about COVID. There's so many things that we can do that actually work towards the goal of getting people elected in a fair way. And I think that that's a real opportunity that we have, as well as educating people about what the issues really are.
Yeah, so really looking at a big global way to move equity forward.
If I can tack on to Representative Titone's point, actually, I think that her experience in the Colorado State Legislature really speaks to exactly how much education works. And I can say this as a person who's been working in Colorado for a very long time. And I actually first began testifying as a young lawyer on the Colorado's Anti-Discrimination Act back in the late 90s to add LGBT anti-discrimination to our employment laws in the state. And I actually, in the early 2000s, wrote the part of the law that included the anti-discrimination for transgender people. And if you read Colorado's law, it's really wacky, because I basically had to sneak it in under the definition of sex, of sexual orientation. And so when you read the law, you're like, what kind of crazy backward person wrote this? But it speaks to the time, which is that at the time, people had no idea what we were even talking about. And the way to make it happen was to sort of get it in under the radar. But as I was testifying at the legislature in those years, I remember the kinds of questions that people would ask me are like, are we talking about the boots and buckles community? I'm like, I don't even know what you're talking about here. But what I'm really talking about is people who just want to do their jobs and go to work every day and get judged on the work they're doing and not on their identity. So let's just focus there. But the degree to which the LGBTQ rights agenda, the homosexual agenda, has moved forward in these decades is really astounding when you think about the fact that it was not that long ago in the course of history that same-sex consensual sexual contact was illegal. And now we've moved to a point where you know, we can all get married, which was never my big goal, but I did. And, but, you know, and now we can work. You know, it's an amazing thing that we moved from the point in the 80s where it was illegal for us to even engage in consensual conduct. And now there's a Supreme Court decision that very matter-of-factly, just without any kind of raising of eyebrows at all, talks about people transitioning. And so, you know, education works, and that's an amazing opportunity. And the longer we go and continue to testify in our own state legislatures, bring in kids like this mentee of mine who came and spoke so eloquently about their own life experience and really touches the hearts of the people who are making these decisions, and make them step back and think, okay, I don't need to simply jump on the bandwagon of these national organizations that are bringing in these crazy red meat agenda items to try to work people up. It does make a difference over time.
Yeah, well, and I'll say as well, so at HRC, we're tracking about 874 pieces of legislation in state legislatures across the country. And we talked about some of the bad ones. We had about 180 bills, bad bills introduced so far this year, with 3 of them becoming law, 2 of them specifically targeting trans people. But even as that is true, we also had 370 good bills introduced across the country, 24 of which became law, and we had a good regulation coming out of Utah banning conversion therapy in Utah. And those kinds of bills that passed are all kinds of different things. And we talked about panic defense, which is incredibly important. I will just hop on the horn here. I'm from Northern Virginia, and I was just absolutely delighted this year to be part of an effort alongside Equality Virginia and a coalition of folks down here to pass the Virginia Values Act, which is comprehensive non-discrimination bill in Virginia. Virginia is now the first state in the South to have LGBTQ non-discrimination protections. It's the first state in about 10 years to have added both sexual orientation and gender identity. In the last several years, mostly folks have been adding gender identity on, which is also wonderful. I don't mean to downplay that, but in Virginia, you know, it was a purple state when I moved here. It's definitely more blue now these days than it used to be. Still south of Mason-Dixon line, still a good old boy place in a lot of ways. And we had really bad non-discrimination law just a year ago. I mean, it included public employees and housing and credit, and that's it. No places of public accommodation for any protected characteristic, no employment in private employment for any protected characteristic. And now Virginia has comprehensive non-discrimination protections in public employment, private employment, housing, places of public accommodations, and credit for a large list of protected characteristics that includes sexual orientation and gender identity, but is very much not limited to it. And it was an incredible accomplishment that was made possible. I think it's important to say that this work had been happening for a long time, and this is not the first year that you know this work has been attempted in Virginia. While the General Assembly has been under Republican control until just the last election, you know, the folks on the ground who've been doing this work were able to make incredible advances in terms of having bills heard and having them even pass a chamber, but Republican leadership was just never going to allow them to become law. And then this year, I'm not slandering the Republicans, I promise, because this year, the Virginia Values Act, which is much more sweeping than the legislation that folks had been working on before, passed with bipartisan majorities. And it, you know, passed unanimously out of one of the committees. I don't think we can boast the same vote count that Representative Titone can on hers, but like I mean, it was an incredible thing, and I think it's important. I completely agree with what Mari said about the trajectory of this movement and the work, and how incredible it is that we have made so much progress in such a short period of time. And I think it's important that we remember that even as there are setbacks, which I am confident are going to come in the wake of the Bostick decision, we are going to see setbacks in the states. I feel very strongly that that's true. I think at the same time that we're dealing with those setbacks, we have to remember that we have pushed the ball forward and we can continue to push the ball forward.
One of the phrases that jumps out to me that you just said, Kate, is folks on the ground.
Yeah.
And thinking about all of the work that people have done across the U.S., really on the state level, the local level, and connecting to the federal level, and really brings to my mind the upsurge of folks on the ground around racial justice activism that's been happening in the past few weeks. I mean, going on a month now, and so wondering if you all could speak to how at the state level, LGBTQ legislation, as we're moving forward, might be able to intersect with the racial justice activism that's happening right now.
Well, I'll start by saying very simply, like just using the Virginia Values Act as an example, and certainly Virginia as an example of a state that doesn't quite have all of the racial stuff figured out yet. We still have a lot of baggage left over from the Confederacy, and we, like many other places, are struggling with these issues. And a very simple example, and it is much more complicated than this, so I'll admit that up front, but a very simple example is the Virginia Values Act increased protections on the basis of race and religion, and as well as I said, sexual orientation and gender identity. And so as we're passing the legislation that we're passing to help the LGBTQ community, it is incumbent upon us to make sure that we are doing that in coalition, that we are certain that we are lifting all boats as we do this work, and that we're making sure that we don't ever inadvertently undercut protections that exist for other folks. And that is, as we're working on non-discrimination bills, a lot of times that's one of the options that comes up, which is, well, sure, we'll give you this. How about you take this exemption? And if that exemption is going to hurt folks, we can't take the step forward. And then I'll add as well, Pride started as a protest, and this is a movement that very much owes our success and our momentum to the folks who threw bricks through windows and who resisted arrest and who resisted being put in jail because of simply who they were, or having other adverse consequences just because of who they were. And I think it is very incumbent upon us as a community to make sure that we are standing in solidarity for those of us who are white and for those of us who are not white, making sure that everybody is heard in the LGBTQ community and represented in the work that we do.
Yeah,
the opportunities for, go ahead, Brianna, sorry to step on your toes.
That's okay. We didn't know. One of the things that I wanted to say was one group that we don't mention a lot in our conversations are Black trans women, especially because they're the most vulnerable group. And I don't know, we didn't really discuss how the gay and trans panic defense ultimately went through, but the bill was actually introduced as a House bill, and it was about to be heard in the Senate, and then COVID happened, and they rushed through to try to just get rid of things that weren't relevant to COVID, and that bill ended up being on the chopping block, even though the Republicans tried to stop the Democrats from killing the bill, which was really kind of an interesting scenario, because that normally wouldn't happen. So when I found out that the bill was killed, I said, wait a minute, why did you do that? Like, this didn't cost any money. And to me, I was listening to the voices outside and the protests outside the Capitol, and they were talking about Black Lives Matter. And to me, as a trans person, it's my job to lift up Black trans voices, because they don't have any representation. There's very few people. There's two that I know of in Minnesota, the city councilors, Andrew Jenkins and Philippe Cunningham, but that's all the elected voice that they have in the whole entire country. So we really have to make an effort to bring them into the conversation. And I said, they're talking about Black Lives Matters, and this bill really pertains to Black lives and Black trans lives. So that's when I really sprung into action and said, hey guys, we got to bring this back, and we got to pass it, because it's bipartisan. Everybody wants this. And whenever anybody asks me about it in an interview or a press release, I always put Black trans lives in the press release, because nobody put it in there. And they said, hey, we've got a press release, here's what we've come up with. I'm like, no. Like, again, you're leaving out Black trans women in this press release. So I really had to be diligent about really making that point of saying that we are failing Black trans lives if we don't mention them and how vulnerable they are. And this was a really good opportunity to bring that to the forefront and make sure that everybody understood that these are lives that are important. And, you know, we still see a lot of violence against Black trans lives all over. And I hope that more states will adopt this panic defense ban. 11 states now have it, and I think that it's just, I mean, look at the bipartisan support we had for this in Colorado. I think also the last one was, maybe, was it Connecticut that did it before us? And it was very, very bipartisan as well. I can't remember what state it was, but it was almost a unanimous vote there. Let's just do this. And let's make a statement that we want to protect Black trans women, particularly, as well as all the LGBT community that's out there, because there is a lot of intersection between LGBT and a lot of those cultural gaps that happen, that there's not a lot of acceptance for LGBT people. So this is a good opportunity to have that conversation.
I think when we're talking about intersectionality, there's so much opportunity for intersectionality with what's going on in the Black Lives Matter movement and what's going on in the LGBTQ movement, because when we look at who is being left out of the picture, when we're looking at the concept of defunding the police and demilitarizing the police and investing more resources in communities, in health services and mental health services and all of those sorts of things, who is that going to impact? That's going to impact the people who are on the fringes and who have been disenfranchised, which necessarily means people of color and LGBTQ people, particularly Black trans women. I agree with you entirely, Representative Titone, on that. But when we're talking about trying to, for example, improve access to healthcare, who's got the worst access to healthcare? People of color, and particularly transgender people and transgender people of color. Who has got the worst experiences in the prison and jail context? Transgender people, and particularly transgender people of color. I mean, when we're talking about who is subjected most to solitary confinement, we're talking about trans people of color. When we're talking about who experiences the most prevalence of sexual assault while they're in custody, we're talking about trans people of color. So the intersectionality is very, very obvious, and we certainly are all in this together.
Kate, you're about to say something?
I was just gonna say New Jersey was the other state. I looked it up while you were speaking, and I completely agree with everything that both of you have said. I mean, and just to call out very specifically what we're all alluding to is that for folks who exist and have more than one marginalized identity, the discrimination is compounded, and sometimes, you know, compounded in orders of magnitude. And there's epidemic of violence against trans women, particularly trans people, particularly trans women of color across the country. And it's incumbent upon all of us to, you know, to work on eliminating the discrimination and all of the factors that get people, you know, into these situations that are so dangerous, and you know, to have folks feel that they can be violent with impunity, and that, you know, these lives aren't important and that no one will notice. And, you know, that is just not true. These people are people. Black trans lives matter. We have got to make sure that we are doing everything that we can to try to make sure that people are safe, and that for the people who are, you know, perpetrating crimes, that, you know, they are held accountable in the way that makes the most sense.
Great. I think that there's time for maybe one or two questions from folks that are watching. If you want to type in, I'm not exactly sure how, Jordan, on the back end, Jordan, for those of you who are watching or part of this, is from ACS and is coordinating some of those logistics back there. So not quite sure how the questions could come in, but if there is a question for folks who are watching to ask our panelists. And nothing is popping up on my screen. So what I will ask of you all is if there's, great, so Jordan is saying that folks can submit questions using the Q&A feature. And then I see that on there. So there's no questions that have popped up on my screen, great. So the question that I'll have for our panelists is, if there's one thing that you would like progressive lawyers, who are the folks who are watching this, to know about state legislation to support LGBTQ advocacy or equality, excuse me, as they're advocating, what would you like their nugget to be for them to take home with them?
I'll go first. I think that one of the areas that has really been kind of left out is really trans and non-binary people. And we have seen some laws in Colorado and other states have put X gender marker and changing those on documents. And I think that that's really an area that we should really focus on, because those folks are being left out, and they're being going through a really tough process of changing their documentation and outing themselves through publication of a name change. So, you know, if you want to check out some of the stuff that we've done in Colorado around Jude's Law, that was a big change in a lot of those aspects of things. And I think that's really where we really need to start focusing on, because we've left them out of the conversation a lot. And we need to merely step up and make sure that we're letting them feel like they have a voice and that people are paying attention to them.
Mari, how about you go?
Okay. I don't have anything really brilliant to say. I think that we can't underestimate the upcoming risks of the religious rights issues being used as a justification for continued discrimination. So I think if there's one thing for all of us to really be focused on right now, is working in coalitions to stem the tide on the justification of religious rights as a means for discrimination. We need to really figure out strategically how we're going to address that, because that is absolutely the next and most dangerous frontier for all of us.
I totally agree. And then I totally agree with what both of you have said. And I'll say the nugget that I would like for people to take away is the incredible importance of state legislation in the day-to-day lives for LGBTQ people. Yeah, and this is very similar to what you were saying, Representative Titone. I think we look at what's happening at the Supreme Court, and that's sexy and fun. And we look at the Trump administration and their egregious series of rollbacks, one after another. And it's easy to look at that and to feel like that's the be all and end all. And that's obviously incredibly important. Those can have incredible ripple effects. I'm talking about the ACA and people's access to healthcare and people's access to all kinds of things, right, is determined by the federal government. But when we're talking about someone's day-to-day lived experience, it's state legislation that is, in my view, really impactful for what that looks like, whether that is marriage, right, or divorce, or custody, right, or whether it's having a driver's license that reflects your gender identity so that you're not outed every time you have to hand your license over. Or whether it's having a discrimination claim in court. But I mean, it goes to many other things. State legislation touches almost every facet of our lives. And so to ask folks to pay attention to what's happening in your states, and be aware that your clients may or may not have a lot of knowledge about what's happening at the state legislature, but that's going to impact their lives one way or the other. And then, related to that knowledge, I think it's important to say that, even as these bad bills are introduced and happily often defeated, that doesn't mean that the rhetoric, that messaging, right? We've been talking about the concern around the messaging, and that our opponents are, I'm sorry for the dinging, our opponents are introducing these bills for messaging purposes, right? That messaging impacts our lives, and it will impact your clients' lives. And so please be sensitive to that too, as you're navigating the world alongside them, that, that's something that they are facing. And it may impact their perspective and their feelings of safety and their feelings of fear.
Well, thank you three so much for sharing the knowledge and experience that you have around state level legislation and moving LGBTQ equality forward. And I want to make a small plug for my organization, the Quality Federation. And Kate, you had mentioned that the bills, the pro and anti-LGBTQ bills that that we have seen in the past year, and one of the things that we have on our website, Equality Federation, is a legislation tracker. And so it's just open, and so everyone can look at that of what are the bills that are moving forward in different state houses across the U.S. This is things for folks to look at if you're paying attention. And again, thank you, the three of you, so much for being here. It was a delight, and I want to pass it off to April to close us out.
I also wanted to thank you, Representative Deanna González, for moderating this amazing panel. I want to direct everyone's attention to the chat that has the information about MCLE credit. I'm going to repeat it again now. This event has been approved for 1 hour of California MCLE credit. If you would like to claim your CLE credit, please send an email to lcemails@acslaw.org to receive your certificate of completion and feedback form. Put progressive federalism and the LGBTQ community in the subject line. CLE written materials are available on this event's webpage on the acslaw.org website. The ACS, as a nonprofit, makes no statement about any political affiliations. Thank you for attending, and once again, thank you to our panelists, Representative Brianna Titone, Mari Newman, and Cathryn Oakley. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye-bye.